Our first med talk will be presented by Shareif Abdelwahab. Shareif is a first-year medical student at Rutgers University Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. He is currently completing a distinction in medical innovation and entrepreneurship with a focus on improving health outcomes in underserved communities. Shareif is co-founder of RenCare LLC, which is a digital healthcare startup that helps patients with end-stage renal disease transition to home-based dialysis. Prior to medical school, Shareif worked at an international law firm in Paris and Dubai, wherein he represented government entities and commercial clients in proceedings before international tribunals. He currently serves as founder and principal of Safina LLC, which advises clients in the healthcare media and energy sectors in international negotiations, mediations, and arbitration proceedings. He is bilingual in English and Arabic. And now, please join us in welcoming Shareif.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, for that warm introduction, and to the hosts of MedTalk for arranging and hosting today's talk. My talk is entitled Reflections from Moria, Language, Life, and Refugees. In 2018, amidst the height of the refugee crisis, I embarked on a medical mission to serve as an Arabic language interpreter for the more than 12,000 refugees who called Moria home. Serving as an interpreter for children, adults, and the elderly alike, I came to learn valuable lessons about the importance of language, communication, and advocacy to the practice of medicine. During my time in Moria, I also had the distinct opportunity to learn the harrowing stories of the individuals who called Moria home. In so doing, it had a profound impact on me as I began to reassess fundamental questions about the ways in which I would lead my life in the service of others. It ultimately led me to decide to leave behind a successful career in law to start afresh in medicine. And today, I'll share with you my story. During my first night in Moria, a group of volunteers rushed to the shores as word quickly spread of 3 dinghies coming on to the shore amidst heavy rains and a torrential storm. Salam, the Arabic greeting meaning peace that we were trained to say as the boats drew near. You are now in Greece and the European Union. As the boats drew near and the refugees disembarked off the rafts, they were given food, water, and blankets before being taken to Greece's, and indeed the world's, most notorious refugee camp. This is Moria, home to over 12,000 refugees during the height of the refugee crisis. Described in such flattering terms as the Guantanamo Bay of Europe and the worst place on earth, Moria was an open-air prison having all the signs of depravity, from the stench of sewage to the sense of hopelessness that gripped those who had languished there for years. Moria was so bad that some people had actually volunteered to return home to their war-torn countries after having risked their lives just to come here. Moria was an accident of birth, conceived hastily to stem the tide of migrants coming to Europe. For 400 years, Lesbos, the island on which Moria was located, served as a summer getaway for those well-to-do and as a port of entry to Europe. But in more recent years, it has served unwittingly as a refuge for those fleeing war, poverty, and nightly patrols from the Turkish Coast Guard, all in search for a better life. In 2020, Moria was burned to the ground twice. Its inhabitants were displaced and dispossessed, and many of them remain without shelter or legal status to this very day. Now, along the shores of Lesbos, you will find an entire graveyard of life jackets and broken boats, representing those individuals who drowned at sea whilst making that harrowing journey, as you can see here. As I mentioned, as I may have mentioned, Despite the fact that I have said all that I have just said about Moria, many of you may not have actually known much about it, let alone heard of the harrowing stories of its inhabitants. Some of you who are fans of the Lord of the Rings novels may have mistaken it even for the wealthy metropolis that shares its name. Imagine that, 12,000 voices, all made collectively voiceless. I admit I did not know much about Moria until I arrived there. In 2018, I embarked on a medical mission to serve as an Arabic language interpreter for the thousands of refugees who called this place home. And through language and through this experience, I came to learn their harrowing stories and learn many life lessons. I'd like to share 3 of those lessons with you here today. The first lesson is about language as a means for building trust. "You are safe here with us," I shouted reassuringly as I competed with the sounds that was buzzing all around us, of the noise of things banging all around us. We sat under the baking sun in the triage room. That was just a euphemism for this outdoor space that had been sectioned off by these makeshift dividers, these uncomfortable plastic chairs, kicked up gravel, and nary a hint of comfort or privacy. Now, throughout the day, I had seen this individual stand patiently in line while in incredible pain. He had been there since dawn and had stayed until this line had swelled. But when his name was finally called and it was his turn to speak up, he remained silent, completely unresponsive to our questions. "There are spies who are here who will take me back," he mumbled to himself, unbeknownst to everyone but me. "This is a jail," he said as he looked around paranoidally at the barbed wire fencing and austere surroundings of the camp. I actually couldn't blame him for thinking that this was a rather draconian place. This place really did look like a jail. But having seen him in his state and hearing him say what he said, I knew that his problems extend beyond the physical pains and symptoms that he was here for today. We needed to understand them and understand his plight. So I told him, "We're not Syrian spies. I'm too clumsy to be a spy for one, And, well, trying without embarrassing myself to speak in a Syrian accent, I told him, "Ana ya zalama ma ba'raf ahki bis-Suri mnih," which meant, I don't really know how to speak with a Syrian accent very well. That put him at ease, and he began to laugh a little bit, and he said, "Yeah, you're right. Your Syrian accent isn't really good at all. You sound more like one of those people in those old black and white movies I used to watch with my dad," in reference to both my Egyptian accent and heritage and the old Egyptian movies that once dominated Arab film industry throughout the Arab world. So our conversation continued, and we started giving and taking a little bit more, and I sensed that he was slowly becoming increasingly disarmed. So over the course of several of these visits, I came to build his trust. He still thought that this place was a jail, and again, I don't blame him for thinking that. But slowly and surely, he came to see that the clinic, at least, was a refuge. And so finally sensing this, I introduced him to his doctor, and together we looked him right in the eyes, listened intently to his story, and connected with him during his most vulnerable moment. This 19-year-old man had his right leg amputated hastily below the knee following an airstrike on his home in Syria. He was forced to flee under the cover of night, and while he was crossing the Aegean Sea into Lesbos, he had dropped his pain medication. He was tortured, imprisoned, and suffered from PTSD, and he was having episodes right then and there that were being triggered by the austere nature of the camp. He would often wake up in a pool of his own sweat and urine after having vivid nightmares each night. This was all too embarrassing for him to ever share with anyone. It was too much of a shame. He didn't share it with anyone before until he finally opened up and shared it with us. By knowing his story and digging deeper into his life, we were able to advocate successfully on his behalf with camp officials. They ultimately decided to move him to Athens, the capital of Greece, where he got the medical and psychological care that he so desperately needed. This was medicine in its purest form. Crossroads between listening, advocating, and healing. And language was the linchpin weaving in the patient's story into the way in which we practice medicine and guiding us in the way in which we were able to serve him. The second lesson is about language humanizing individuals. Now, many of us here today and on Zoom have a preconceived view of refugees as being downtrodden and destitute. Many of us have never even met refugees, and yet we have this preconceived notion. And the story that I'm about to share, Muhammad, not his real name, shows us just how wrong of a view that is. Muhammad comes from a well-to-do family. He was a successful electrician in his native Algeria. He was well-read, extremely well-read, and spoke 3 languages, Arabic, French, and Berber. He would often come to our clinic, because he suffered from diabetes, and so he needed to have his blood sugar levels measured regularly. And during the course of each visit, he would always complain to me about the sweltering conditions throughout the camp and how the air conditioning units were not working properly. As an electrician, he can see that the air conditioning units were operating, but they were not blowing in any cool air. So I'd always try to encourage him to speak to the camp officials in the hopes that they would undertake those repairs. But maybe dejected and resigned to his fate, he would always look down and say, Inshallah, Inshallah, Shareif, one day. Now, if you know anything about this word, it has one of 2 meanings. In its more modern sense, it's used when someone has lost all hope. Literally, it means God willing. And in today's context, it's used to mean that unless by a miracle of God, that's the only way this thing or this event will happen. But it also has a deeper meaning that's rooted in history, one that means, or that is used in the form of a promise. And is that second meaning that I reminded Muhammad about during our conversation one day. I said, Inshallah is a promise, Muhammad. And as he looked down, he looked up at me, not knowing what to say, but nodding his head with a smile on his face. We said our goodbyes, and that was it. Or so I thought. A few days later, as I'm walking into the camp early in the morning, I hear someone yell, Masri! That's the Arabic word that means Egyptian, that Muhammad would often use. He would often forget my name, but that's what he would use endearingly when he would see me in the clinic. I spoke to the camp officials like you had suggested, and they told me it would take several weeks for a technician to make the repairs. So I told them, you know what? Just give me the parts and I'll do the repairs myself. And then there was Sarah, a fellow volunteer and interpreter who was also a former refugee of Moria, who had since been resettled in Germany. She came back to volunteer and advocate on behalf of the refugees who remained left behind. During the course of my time working with her, I learned her harrowing story too. My sister and I are swimmers, she would say to me proudly during a rare break in the day. What an understatement, I thought to myself, and as I will share with you now. Sada grew up in Syria, and like most normal people, had a pretty good upbringing until the Civil War began a few years ago. She was about 20 at the time and was completing her studies in university. And because of the war, obviously, she could no longer do that. So in 2015, she fled with her then 17-year-old sister Yusra to Turkey. And they arranged with the smuggler to board them onto an overcrowded raft where they would make that same harrowing journey across the Aegean Sea. Now, during the course of that journey, the waters became increasingly choppy. And there was a fear amongst those on board that the raft would take on water and capsize, and that many of them would drown. Sada and Yusra did what any other swimmer would have done in that situation, or so they say. But quite frankly, very few of us would have done what they did under similar circumstances. They jumped out of the raft into the sea and grabbed opposite ends of the raft. And for the next 3 hours, these incredible women guided this overcrowded raft safely to the shores of Lesbos. Fatigued and tired, they were taken to Moria, where they stayed there briefly before being resettled. Sada and Yusra went on to do great things. Sada, for one, now, as I mentioned, has been resettled in Germany and is a law student and a human rights activist. She's been featured in countless media outlets, including a TED Talk or two, as you can see here on the right of this picture. Her sister Yosra's claim to fame came in the most recent Summer Olympics, in which she swam competitively for the first ever Refugees Olympics team. She now serves as a Goodwill Ambassador for the UNHCR. That's the UN relief agency that serves refugees. It is through medicine that we have a unique opportunity, indeed a privilege, to dig deeper into the lives of our patients and understand them for who they are. When we do so, we're able to learn more, not just about those people as people, but also understand more about ourselves. The third and final lesson is about language and maturity. And if it isn't clear by now, during my time in Moria, I had the distinct privilege of working with some of the most exceptional human beings serving those most in need. As an interpreter, I wasn't just interpreting what my patients were saying. I also had to interpret what the doctors and nurses with whom I was working had to say too. I'll never forget my first time in Moria, my first day on the job. There was a line literally as far as the eye could see. We would see over 200 patients that day alone, and there were exactly 3 Arabic language interpreters on site, and one of them was me. Now, given the disparity in the ratios between patients and interpreters, it goes without saying that I spent a lot of time rotating amongst the medical staff that day, indeed during my time in Moria. That provided an opportunity to work with people, doctors and nurses from all over the world, from the US, Canada, Switzerland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and of course, Greece, amongst others. And during each rotation, I had the opportunity to listen about their call to medicine, their passion for it, why they were there, and what they loved so much about it. I was inspired by the fact that so many of them came from all corners of the world, left behind their busy lives, their families, just to be here to serve this population of people that had long been neglected by the rest of us, to lend an ear to them, to give them a voice to those who, as I mentioned, had been rendered voiceless. This was a completely unsettling exercise for me as I began to reassess fundamental questions about my life and how I would spend it in the service of others. You see, my childhood was shaped by the events of 9/11 and the events arising internationally thereafter. I had believed that through the law was the best means for helping address these issues and helping those who had suffered from war and upheaval. So at the age of 22, I went to law school where I acquired the skills needed to pursue that goal. I then moved abroad, lived in 3 countries, worked in 2 languages, and by the age of 30, I had served as a trusted advisor who could solve vexing problems on the international stage. That's the life I had always dreamed of, I would tell myself. That was me. I ultimately realized, however, that I'm driven by a passion to be on the front lines and care for those who are most vulnerable and in need. Having then thought about it, I returned home to New Jersey, where I then worked in the local ER of 2 local hospitals that serve the local communities right here in and around New Brunswick, where I saw the urgent need firsthand. Millions of people are suffering from a lack of access to adequate medical care, and millions more suffer from diseases that have reached epidemic levels. Look, I understand. I go into this with no false illusion about what the world holds. I know that we live in a world that's obsessed with numbers and efficiency, and that dissuades us from taking the time to know our patients. I get it. But when we do take the time to understand our patients and connect with them and learn their stories, we're unlocking information that's just not clinically relevant to the way in which we practice medicine, but indeed, which is relevant to the way in which we ultimately practice our lives. That was Moria, and this is me, as you can see here. And on the screen, you can see the wonderful people with whom I had the pleasure of working with during my time there. Thank you all very much.